When you bring up the Nazis and the Holocaust, a lot of people get frustrated with you, and they will say things like, "Why are you talking about the Holocaust? Stop talking about the Holocaust. It's old news. It's the past. Get over it. It's never going to happen again." And when I hear someone say something like that, I just say, I spotted the Nazi. I spotted the Hitler sympathizer. And when you look at the social media accounts of people like that, if you look at their, let's say, Twitter account, more than likely they will have a Greco-Roman statue for a profile picture, and they'll be talking about Heidegger. One thing about the Holocaust that I actually never heard anyone point out until I started reading this book, The Third Reich by Michael Berle, is the difference between how the Nazis acted in Western and Northern Europe and how they acted in Eastern Europe. In Western and Northern Europe, the Nazis were a lot more restrained. Yes, they did terrible things, but nowhere near the amount of horrors that they committed in Eastern Europe. In France, the Nazis acted like tourists. They wandered around France, they saw the countryside, they would look at people's flower beds. Yes, they would actually do this. They would sunbathe, they would be walking around just awestruck by France because a lot of them had never been in France before, and a lot of them were very young and they had never seen combat before, and they had just gotten out of military training, and so they were walking around France like they were a bunch of tourists. Yes, they were French people who were murdered by the Nazis. Yes, they were a lot of French people who were sent into concentration camps. But still, what France went through under the Nazis was nowhere near as horrific as what the Polish went through. When the Germans were in Northern Europe, when they were in Denmark, Norway, when they were in the Netherlands, they were very restrained. Yes, they killed people who were not complacent. They killed people who resisted the Nazis. But still, they were a lot more restrained. In Poland, on the other hand, the Nazis murdered millions of people. They murdered Polish Jews. They murdered non-Jewish Poles. They butchered millions of people. Meanwhile, while they were in Denmark or in Norway or in the Netherlands, they didn't butcher millions of people. Why is that? Why the difference? The reason why there was such a difference was because of the ideology of the Nazis. The Nazis saw the Slavs as subhuman, as parasites who had no role in life other than to be slaves to the Germans. That's how they saw the Slavs. They saw the Slavs as being deserving of nothing but to be destroyed or to be slaves to the Germans. You had different spectrums of Nazi. Not all Nazis were the same. You had some that were Catholic and they were medievalists and they wanted to go back to the Middle Ages. But you also had this type of Nazi who wanted to go back to pagan times. They wanted to go back to the ways of the Spartans. They wanted to go back to the ways of the heathens in Europe. And that's where you get the Nazis who were extremely fanatical for Darwinism and euthanasia. The people who wanted to kill off people who had deformities or people who had some sort of handicap. Those were the types of Nazis who wanted to go back to paganism. Because the idea of slaughtering people because they have defects, I mean, that is the complete antithesis to Christianity. And those Nazis were extremely anti-clerical. They were very anti-Christian, anti-Christ, I should say, extremely anti-church. And they had this idea that science was supreme. And so because evolutionism was taken to be legitimate science, as it is today, Darwinism was seen as a part of the supreme truth of Nazism. And if you think about it, going into euthanasia, practicing euthanasia is pagan. It is part of pagandom. And having eugenist and social Darwinistic policy wherein euthanasia would be imposed would definitely be a return back to pagandom. We can go to the Spartans as a reference, and I've said this before. The Spartans had this idea that in order for a child to be worthy of the name Spartan, or if I talk like that annoying narrator in the film 300, in order for a child to be worthy of the name Spartan, or something like that. And I hated that movie, and that was one of the reasons why I hated that film, because it was glorifying eugenics. It was glorifying ancient eugenics. But you had so many douchebags who saw that film and they said, "Oh, it's so nice, it's so awesome. This is Sparta." But it's an evil movie. I hate the movie. It's garbage. Nothing like the beautiful films Braveheart or Gladiator. It's just at least with Braveheart, it was Scottish men who were fighting against the tyranny of the English. Okay, that's a noble idea for a movie. In Gladiator, it was a man who stood up to the despotism of the Roman Empire. Okay, that's fine. But 300, it was just praising the barbarity of the Spartans. So you can go to the Spartans as a reference for ancient euthanasia, but there's also another reference that not a whole lot of people talk about, and that is the human sacrifices that were done by the pre-Christian Celts who were living in Central Europe. So I read this book a couple of years ago. It was on human sacrifice in ancient Europe, and it talked about these archaeological findings in Austria, where they found these bodies who were of people who were they were of people who were obviously ritually murdered. And they analyzed these corpses, and what they found was that these corpses were of people who had deformities. And it wasn't just a one-off. It wasn't just that they found one body of a man who had deformities. It was very, very consistent. And the method of killing was very consistent. And every body they found in this particular archaeological discovery was of a human being who had a deformity. And so that has led scholars to the conclusion that when they would do these human sacrifices, they would specifically choose people who had deformities to be ritually murdered. And they would pick those people, obviously, because they saw them as not worthy of life. Those people are disposable, they're worthless to us, they are of no utilitarian use for us, so who cares? So let's just ritually murder them. And they did. And so Nazism was a return back to paganism. Now, it's very interesting that those ritually murdered people, the corpses of those ritually murdered people, were found in Austria. And I understand that the people who did those murders were Celts, because the original inhabitants of Austria and Germany were Celts, and the Germans actually came later on. But still, that ritual took place in ancient Austria, and that's where Hitler would eventually pop up, and Hitler wanted to go back to paganism. So it's very interesting how you can see these parallels. It's very interesting how that happens. Okay, I'm not going to say it's a parallel, but it's just interesting how that it happened that way. But it is a return to paganism. And if you look at the barbarities of the Nazis, most of the time when historians talk about the horrors of Nazism, they're talking about events that took place in Eastern Europe. Poland is definitely the place where is definitely the place that historians mainly reference when talking about the atrocities that the Nazis committed. But you can go to Russia, Belarus, you can go to the Balkans, Serbia, and you can read about horrific atrocities that were done by the Nazis and their auxiliaries. It's just horrific stuff. And when the Nazis went to Poland, I mean, they just butchered millions of people. And so why the difference? Why such a difference between how the Nazis acted in Poland and how they acted in, let's say, France? And the reason is because the Nazis saw the Eastern Europeans as inferior. There's a movie that perfectly illustrates this, and it's the film called Come and See. I think that Come and See is the best film ever made on the Holocaust. Now, that's my personal opinion. Objectively speaking, Schindler's List is the greatest film ever done on the Holocaust. In terms of acting, in terms of cinematography, in terms of how it's presented, Schindler's List is the best film ever made on the Holocaust, objectively speaking. But for me personally, Come and See was the best movie ever made because it was so intense, and it was like watching a horror movie. And everyone talks about Andrei Tarkovsky when it comes to Slavic movies. Everyone talks about Stalker. You have these film enthusiasts, I also call them film snobs on YouTube, who talk endlessly about Andrei Tarkovsky and how Stalker was a masterpiece. And in my opinion, Stalker is an overrated movie. It's a very boring movie. It's a 3 hour plus long movie just showing three guys walking around talking. That's what Stalker is. Now, if you have a problem with insomnia, if you have a problem with sleeping, just open up your computer and just play Stalker. I think you can watch it on YouTube. Just watch Stalker, and your insomnia will be cured. I have zero doubt about it. Just trust me, because I know I have difficulty sleeping sometimes. And one night I just opened my computer up and I just started playing Stalker. And yeah, guaranteed, it'll put you to sleep. It's such a boring movie. But everyone talks about Andrei Tarkovsky as this exemplary director when it comes to Eastern European film. But not a whole lot of people talk about Elem Klimov. I mean, that guy was a brilliant director. He directed the film Come and See, and that movie was just absolutely magnificent. It was a masterpiece of film, and it was a horrifying movie on the horrors of Nazi atrocities in Eastern Europe. The film takes place in Belarus, and it's about the Nazi occupation of that country. It's such an intense movie, and what made the film, one of the characteristics of the film that make it so unique, is how it puts two film genres together. It puts the genre of historical drama together with horror. It's a masterpiece. It's an absolute masterpiece of a film. And the director was very good at synchronizing these two genres, historic drama and horror. And you can see how, in a way, the film was influenced by the movie The Exorcist. There's a scene in the movie where a bunch of SS officers massacre an entire village, and they force a bunch of children to go inside of a barn, and they burn these children alive. It's an absolutely horrific scene. It's the most horrific scene in the whole movie. After the massacre, a number of Soviet partisans capture these SS officers who committed this atrocity. And there's this older Nazi. He's this short, very cowardly, but very ruthless and cruel man. I mean, this guy didn't mind murdering children and slaughtering an entire village, for crying out loud. But when it came to his own life, all of a sudden he wanted mercy. All of a sudden he believed in mercy. And that's the hypocrisy of evil people. It's that they want mercy for themselves and not for anyone else. They want mercy for no one but them. They want forgiveness for no one but them. Compassion for no one but them. And so this old SS officer is crying and screaming, and he's begging for his life, and these partisans are going to kill him. They're going to kill all these Nazis that they've captured. But they give these Nazis a chance to speak. And the old man is begging for his life, and there's a younger SS officer who comes in, and he calls this old man a cowardly dog, a Hund, as the Germans call a dog. And this Nazi explains exactly how the Nazis thought. He said, "You Slavs are inferior. You are the Untermenschen. You are the subhuman. You are subhuman. And you are good for nothing but destruction." And that scene educates you. It really gives you a graphic presentation as to how the Nazis really, really thought. And that's why I believe that Come and See is a better movie than Schindler's List. The problem with Schindler's List is that it doesn't really educate people on how the Nazis thought. It gives you a very graphic and realistic presentation as to how they killed people, as to how they would do mass executions. But it doesn't educate you on how the Nazis thought and what was the ideology of the Nazis. The ideology of the Nazis was, simply put, the idea that the Germanic human was superior to the non-Germanic human. And the non-Germanic human was good for nothing but destruction and to be a slave of the Germanic person. That is what Nazism was. And due to the law of survival of the fittest, in accordance to Darwinian evolution, the Nazis believed that they had the right to enslave and to butcher and to rape those who were inferior to them, because they saw the world as survival of the fittest. I am stronger than you, therefore I can kill you. I am superior to you, I am more intelligent than you, therefore I have a right to do whatever I want to do to you. And that's it. That was the ideology of the Nazis. It was social Darwinism mixed with the idea of Germanic supremacy. And that's why I say Come and See is a better film, because it educates people on how they thought. That's how they really thought. And that's why there was such a huge chasm between how the Nazis acted in Northern and Western Europe and how they acted in Eastern Europe. In Northern and Western Europe, they were very restrained, and in many cases, they acted like tourists. In Eastern Europe, they felt that they had the right to completely and utterly unleash the demon within them and slaughter and rape and enslave. And there was this one story I read where there was this man who directed a camp, and he actually really felt bad about what the Nazis were doing. He did not want to see Jews and Poles getting butchered. He was very disillusioned with Nazism. He considered himself to be an old-fashioned anti-Semite, but he never wanted to go so far as to exterminate people. And some SS guy came over to him and said, we're going to hang 5 Jews. We need a 6th one because we have 6 ropes from which to hang people. And he said, well, there are no criminals in the camp that I am directing. And this SS guy said, what are you talking about? All Jews are criminals. And this man who was leading the camp, he eventually went to Germany. And then he came back only to see that all the people in the camp were gone. And he said, what happened to them? And there was this younger SS guy who said, you don't know? They all got taken away to the death camps. And he said, all of these Jews are parasites, and soon we will kill them all. And that's how they saw Jews and Slavs. And that's why they acted so differently in Eastern Europe. That's why they acted so much more savagely in Eastern Europe. And people talk about Islam and how the Muslims hate the Jews. And they do. The Muslims, a lot of Muslims hate Jews. A lot of Palestinians hate Jews. And what the world saw on October the 7th really gives us an idea as to how cruel the SS was, and how it gives us an idea as to what type of savagery took place in countries like Poland, where you had Ukrainian nationalists just butchering people like chickens. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, people right now are just focusing on the Palestinians, understandably so, because of what happened and what's been going on in Israel and the West Bank. But people are not paying attention to Europe. There is a demon in Europe, and soon it'll be unleashed. And soon that demon that the world witnessed in the Holocaust will come back. And why will it come back? Because people have no willingness, most people have no willingness to actually educate themselves on the Holocaust. And many people have become so indifferent and so irritated anytime they hear about the Holocaust that we are coming to the point where people, for the most part, don't care about the Holocaust. And when you don't care about the evils that were done in the past, well, the demons that inspired those evils, they're just going to come back. Because indifference to the diabolical leaves a window of opportunity for the diabolical to return. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.